Everyone remembers Batman, the animated series from the 90s. But what about the DC cartoons that came before it? The ones that shaped the Saturday mornings of kids in the 70s and 80s, then vanished like they never existed. Forgotten, buried, ignored. Yet they were bold, colorful, and sometimes just plain weird. How many of these would you still recognize if they flashed on screen? Stay tuned, because we're diving deep into the hidden history of DC animation, where some of your favorite heroes looked very different. The New Adventures of Batman, 1977. This wasn't just another Batman cartoon. It was Filmation's attempt to steal the spotlight back from Hanna-Barbera's Super Friends, and they did it with a big gamble: Bat-Mite. Yes, that magical, pint-sized imp from another dimension who constantly annoyed Batman, and Robin became a regular character. Kids loved him, adults groaned, and the debate still rages about whether he was comic relief or a complete distraction. The New Adventures of Batman premiered in 1977 with Adam West and Burt Ward reprising their live-action roles as Batman and Robin. That alone gave it serious nostalgic appeal. But stylistically, it was pure Filmation: bright colors, limited animation, and dramatic sound effects that often did more work than the visuals. Episodes usually centered on the dynamic duo tackling classic villains like Joker, Penguin, and Catwoman, though the tone leaned more campy than dark. What really makes this show stand out today is how aggressively it leaned into that late 70s Saturday morning vibe. The moral lessons were heavy-handed. Bat-Mite often broke the fourth wall, and the show even featured environmentally conscious themes, pushing Batman into territory the comics never dared. Still, despite its quirks, it had charm. For many kids of the era, this was their very first animated Batman. And though it lasted only 16 episodes, its influence echoed, setting the stage for how Batman cartoons could mix fun with adventure long before the darker interpretations took over. Forgotten? Yes, but it remains a colorful snapshot of Batman between eras, the Superman-Aquaman hour of adventure. This show was never meant to last, yet somehow it did. First airing in 1967, the Superman-Aquaman hour of adventure stuck around in reruns throughout the early 70s, becoming an unlikely staple for kids who craved superhero action. By the time color TVS were in every household, Superman's booming voice and Aquaman's underwater adventures looked futuristic compared to the softer sitcom cartoons of the same era. The format was simple: short, animated adventures featuring DC's biggest names. Superman soared across Metropolis in stories inspired by the comics, while Aquaman commanded sea creatures and clashed with oceanic threats. Other Justice League characters, Green Lantern, Hawkman, Atom, Flash, appeared in rotating segments, making it one of the earliest shared universe cartoons. The animation by Filmation was stiff, but it captured something important: the sense that superheroes weren't just funny sidekicks. They could be larger than life. Kids would rush to the TV, even though the movements were jerky and dialogue stiff. It didn't matter. Seeing Superman punch through walls or Aquaman ride a giant seahorse was enough. By the 70s, when reruns filled Saturday morning slots, it already felt dated next to Hanna-Barbera's slicker productions. Yet for many children, it was their first taste of the Justice League in motion. The show eventually faded into obscurity, buried by the cultural dominance of Super Friends. But make no mistake, this hour of adventure kept DC heroes alive for a generation. Forgotten? Maybe. Foundational? Absolutely. Super Friends, 1973 to 1985. You might laugh at its corniness now, but Super Friends was once the DC cartoon. Beginning in 1973, it introduced the Justice League to millions of kids, complete with campy villains, over-the-top narration, and a relentless mission to teach morals. Each episode ended with lessons about honesty, teamwork, and playing fair, because apparently Batman needed to stop crime and lecture you about homework. The lineup was iconic. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman, later joined by newer faces like Green Lantern, Flash, Hawkman, and more. But the real curveball? The Wonder Twins, Zan and Jaina, plus their monkey Gleek. With powers to turn into water and animals, they became both beloved and ridiculed, depending on who you ask. Visually, it was Hanna-Barbera at its peak. Bright, fluid designs with just enough action to feel exciting. Storylines ranged from foiling Lex Luthor to preventing natural disasters, always with that booming narrator reminding kids that the Justice League stood for truth and justice. Critics at the time dismissed it as too soft, too safe, too repetitive. Yet, for kids, it was a window into a larger DC universe. It ran in multiple versions across more than a decade, evolving but never abandoning its wholesome tone. Forgotten today only because darker, more complex shows overshadowed it, Super Friends still defined what team up meant for an entire generation. Without it, there would be no Justice League cartoons later. The all-new Super Friends Hour, 1977. Think of this as Super Friends turned up a notch. Premiering in 1977, the all-new Super Friends Hour kept the original Justice League lineup, but added a big twist: heavy audience participation. Episodes came with multiple segments, hero adventures, short moral skits, even magic tricks kids could try at home. It wasn't just a cartoon, it was a variety show dressed up in capes. The stories often paired different heroes in unusual team-ups. Batman and Robin might battle aliens, while Wonder Woman and Aquaman faced environmental dangers. But what kids really remembered were the Wonder Twins. Every week, Zan and Jaina's transformations, form of water, form of a gorilla, became a playground. Chant and Gleek the monkey? He was chaos personified. Behind the silliness, though, the show was a reflection of the late 70s. Environmental awareness, safety lessons, and even hints of multiculturalism started seeping into the plots. Heroes would pause the action to remind kids about honesty, recycling, or not wandering off with strangers. It sounds corny now, but it gave parents a reason to approve of Saturday morning viewing. Though it only lasted 2 seasons, it cemented the Wonder Twins into DC lore and proved that cartoons could be more than just fights. They could be educational, too. Today, it's easy to roll your eyes, but back then, this was the definition of must-watch TV for superhero fans. Forgotten, maybe, but its fingerprints are still on the genre. Challenge of the Super Friends, 1978. Now we're talking. If the earlier versions of Super Friends were a little too safe, Challenge of the Super Friends finally brought real stakes, at least by 70s standards. Debuting in 1978, it introduced the Legion of Doom, a dream team of villains who lived in a skull-shaped swamp fortress. Lex Luthor, Sinestro, Black Manta, Cheetah, and more. They were all here, scheming against the Justice League. For kids, this was electric. Heroes had actual rivals, not just nameless crooks or natural disasters. The Legion of Doom felt like a supervillain all-star game. Every episode delivered large-scale battles, elaborate traps, and near escapes. Sure, the heroes always won in the end, but the villains gave them a run for their money. Animation-wise, it was still Hanna-Barbera's familiar style, but the writing sharpened. The show balanced campy banter with genuine tension, something rare for the era. Suddenly, Batman wasn't just lecturing. He was dodging deadly lasers while Superman clashed with Bizarro. Challenge of the Super Friends lasted only 16 episodes, but it left an outsized mark. Fans still consider it the high point of the Super Friends saga. It dared to make villains matter and gave kids a taste of the kind of superhero drama we take for granted today. Forgotten by the mainstream, yes, but among DC fans, it remains legendary. World's Greatest Super Friends, 1979. If Challenge of the Super Friends gave us supervillain drama, World's Greatest Super Friends dialed the weirdness up with a heavy dose of fantasy. Premiering in 1979, this short-lived season took the Justice League out of Metropolis and Gotham and threw them into fairy tale adventures, time travel escapades, and even magical realms. Yes, you could see Superman flying through Arthurian castles or Batman dealing with sorcerers. The premise leaned into a late 70s cultural obsession: fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons was taking over, Star Wars had made space adventure mainstream, and studios were desperate to mash up superheroes with mythic storytelling. Episodes featured everything from the heroes meeting King Arthur to facing demonic sorcerers who looked straight out of pulp novels. It wasn't your average crime-fighting fare. What made it both fascinating and bizarre was how seriously the show treated these stories. Narrators spoke with gravitas, and characters often delivered speeches about destiny and courage as though they were starring in Shakespeare. For kids, it was equal parts exciting and confusing. Why was Aquaman suddenly hanging out in a medieval dungeon? Why was Wonder Woman battling giants? Nobody knew, but it looked cool. World's Greatest Super Friends only ran for 8 episodes, overshadowed by stronger seasons before and after. Yet it's remembered for its sheer willingness to experiment. This was the moment DC Animation tried to blend superheroes with the sword and sorcery craze, creating a surreal hybrid that never fully caught on. Forgotten by most, it remains a cult curiosity for fans who enjoy watching Superman pull double duty as a knight in shining armor. The Plastic Man Comedy Adventure Show, 1979-1981. Plastic Man may not top DC's hero charts today, but in 1979, he was given his very own starring role. The Plastic Man Comedy Toy Adventure Show was Filmation's attempt to build a Saturday morning powerhouse, complete with a hero who could stretch, morph, and crack wise in every situation. It was part superhero cartoon, part slapstick comedy, and somehow lasted longer than many more famous DC experiments. The show followed Plastic Man, his girlfriend Penny, and a goofy sidekick named Hula Hula. Together they faced bizarre villains like Dr. Dome, Toyman, and Carrot Man. Yes, Carrot Man. Each episode leaned on Plas's elastic abilities to deliver sight gags, exaggerated action, and plenty of pratfalls. His powers made him unpredictable, and his personality was equal parts confident hero and bumbling goof. What really made the show stand out, though, was its structure. It wasn't just Plastic Man. The block included bonus segments featuring characters like Baby Plas, Mighty Man and Yuck, Fangface, and even Rickety Rocket. It was a full-blown cartoon variety hour, with Plastic Man as the star attraction. Despite its silly tone, kids adored it. The colorful animation, non-stop jokes, and bizarre rogues gallery gave it a unique identity. Adults, of course, wrote it off as too goofy, but that was the point. It leaned into comedy harder than any DC show before or since. The Plastic Man Comedy Adventure Show ran until 1981, a rare 2-season victory for Filmation's DC outings. Today, it's a forgotten gem, remembered mainly by fans who still laugh at its outrageous villains and slapstick chaos. Plastic Man might not be DC's biggest name, but for a brief moment, he was the Saturday morning king of comedy. The Kids Superpower Hour with Shazam, 1981-1982. In 1981, Filmation tried something new, a hybrid show that mixed live-action comedy sketches with animated superhero adventures. The highlight of the block was Shazam, bringing Captain Marvel and the Marvel family to Saturday mornings for the first time in years. The animated segments followed Billy Batson transforming into Captain Marvel to battle villains like Dr. Sivana, Black Adam, and Mr. Mind. The style was Filmation at its most colorful, simple animation, bold designs, and heavy narration. For kids, the appeal was instant. Lightning transformations, magical villains, and a hero who looked just as powerful as Superman. But the Kid Superpower Hour format was its downfall. Half the show was taken up by live-action comedy bits with actors playing goofy teenage superheroes, and the tone clashed badly with the animated segments. Viewers tuning in for straight superhero action had to sit through skits that felt more like rejected Saturday Night Live parodies for kids. The animated Shazam stories, however, were genuine fun. They gave Captain Marvel a rare moment in the spotlight, decades before his resurgence in modern comics and film. Unfortunately, the series only lasted one season before being quietly canceled. Today, the Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam is almost completely forgotten, overshadowed by Super Friends and other DC shows of the time. But for the kids who saw Billy Batson's lightning strike on screen, it was unforgettable, a brief but magical experiment in bringing DC's magical hero to Saturday mornings. Shazam animated segments. The Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam, 1981 to 1982. By the early 80s, Filmation took a gamble on Captain Marvel, better known today as Shazam. The character had been a comic book superstar in the 1940s, but had slipped into obscurity by the 70s. So when the Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam debuted in 1981, it was meant to reintroduce him to a new generation. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The show mixed live-action comedy sketches with animated superhero segments. In the Shazam shorts, Billy Batson transformed into Captain Marvel to battle villains like Dr. Sivana and Black Adam, all while learning wholesome lessons along the way. The animation was Filmation's usual blend of colorful but stiff action, with exaggerated voice acting to sell the drama. Kids tuning in were often confused. Half the show was silly live-action sketches. The other half was animated superheroics. The result was uneven, and ratings never took off. Still, for those who did watch, the Shazam cartoons had charm. Captain Marvel's colorful costume, lightning bolt transformations, and larger-than-life villains stood out compared to the safer tone of Super Friends. What's fascinating now is how this series tried to revive a golden age icon decades before the character re-emerged in modern films. For a brief moment, Captain Marvel had a place on Saturday mornings, even if the experiment fizzled after one season. Today, these cartoons are practically lost media, rarely discussed outside hardcore DC history. Circles forgotten? Definitely. But they proved that even the most sidelined heroes got their shot at Saturday morning glory. Superman, 1988. By the late 80s, DC was desperate to modernize its biggest hero for a new generation. Enter Ruby Spears' Superman in 1988. Unlike the campy cartoons of the 70s, this series leaned into slicker animation, sharper writing, and a tone closer to the comic books. It even had an original John Williams-inspired theme that felt cinematic. And yet, it vanished almost as soon as it arrived. The series featured Superman battling classic villains like Lex Luthor, Metallo, and Darkseid, with Lois Lane, Perry White, and Jimmy Olsen all in supporting roles. The animation was leaps ahead of Filmation's work, with fluid motion and more dynamic action scenes. It felt like DC was finally catching up to what Marvel was doing with animation at the time. But the real gem of the show was its Superman Family Album segments. These shorts showed Clark Kent's childhood in Smallville, from his first discovery of powers to his awkward teenage years. It humanized Superman in a way few cartoons had ever attempted, and kids connected with seeing him struggle just like they did. Despite strong production values, the series was doomed by poor scheduling and lack of promotion. It lasted just one season of 13 episodes before disappearing into obscurity. In hindsight, It feels like the missing link between the campy Super Friends era and the groundbreaking Batman, the animated series that came only a few years later. Forgotten by the mainstream, but beloved by those who stumbled on it, Ruby Spears' Superman remains one of DC's most underrated animated outings. The Freedom Force, 1978-1979. If you blinked during Saturday mornings in 1978, you probably missed The Freedom Force, a short-lived animated series bundled inside Tarzan and the Super 7. While not as famous as Super Friends, it was one of Filmation's most daring attempts to expand DC-style superhero storytelling beyond the Justice League formula. The lineup was unique: Isis, Hercules, Sinbad, Merlin, and a futuristic astronaut named Super Samurai. Yes, it was as strange as it sounds. The team operated out of Mount Olympus and battled villains pulled from mythology, fantasy, and science fiction. The concept leaned hard into the late 70s craze for mixing superheroes with epic adventure, giving kids something that felt part comic book, part legend. Episodes were short, around 15 minutes, and only 5 were ever made. That brevity is why the series vanished so quickly, overshadowed by Batman and Superman's dominance on Saturday mornings. Yet for the kids who caught it, the show had a charm all its own. Seeing a team-up of mythic and original heroes fighting side by side made it stand out from the endless parade of Scooby-Doo clones. Today, the Freedom Force is almost entirely forgotten, surviving mostly through grainy VHS recordings and DVD anthologies of Tarzan and the Super 7. But it represents an era when studios were willing to experiment, to throw together heroes from every corner of mythology and see what clicked. Short-lived, strange, but bold, this forgotten mini-series showed that Saturday mornings could be far more eclectic than just capes and cowls. The New Adventures of Gilligan's Planet, 1982. Yes, you read that right. DC's connection here wasn't through superheroes at all, but through Hanna-Barbera's licensing experiment that tied into the same Saturday morning slots, dominated by the Super Friends. In 1982, Gilligan's Island was reimagined as Gilligan's Planet. And while it wasn't strictly cape and cowl, it shared the same production block that DC cartoons thrived in, often airing side by side. The concept? Take the familiar stranded crew and launch them into space. Instead of trying to escape a desert island, Gilligan, the skipper, and the gang were suddenly marooned on a strange alien planet filled with bizarre creatures, wacky civilizations, and cosmic misadventures. It was a complete departure from anything resembling realism, but in a Saturday morning lineup that included Captain Caveman, Plastic Man, and Super Friends, it somehow fit right in. What makes Gilligan's Planet a forgotten gem is how quickly it disappeared. The series only lasted 1 season, and because it was such an odd hybrid of sitcom nostalgia and space-age cartoon tropes, it never found a steady audience. The humor leaned on slapstick, Gilligan's bumbling antics, and sci-fi twists that felt more like parodies than serious storytelling. In hindsight, it showed how experimental networks were willing to be in the early 80s. Just as DC's heroes were bouncing between fantasy worlds, alien threats, and morality tales, other shows like Gilligan's Planet filled the same airwaves with equally surreal concepts. Though not a superhero cartoon, its presence in the same Saturday morning ecosystem makes it part of that forgotten legacy. Today, few remember Gilligan's alien misadventures, but for kids who stumbled across it, it was proof that in the early 80s, absolutely anything could be animated. Forgotten? Completely. But it's one of those curiosities that remind us just how strange Saturday mornings once were. The Legend of the Superheroes, 1979. Okay, this one isn't a pure cartoon, but it deserves a spot because it felt like one come to life. In 1979, NBC aired The Legend of the Superheroes, 2 live-action specials that were basically Saturday morning cartoons played by actors. Bright costumes, campy acting, slapstick plots, it was the closest thing to a human-sized Hanna-Barbera episode. The specials featured a Justice League lineup including Batman, Robin, Flash, Green Lantern, Hawkman, Captain Marvel, and Huntress. Their villains? The Legion of Doom, with Solomon Grundy, Riddler, Mordru, and more. The sets were cheap, the fights cheesy, and the humor relentless. One episode was a straightforward battle of good versus evil. The second was literally a roast of the superheroes, where villains mocked them in a comedy format. Critics hated it. Fans mostly laughed. But for kids, it was surreal. These were characters they'd only seen in comics or animation, suddenly bumbling across their TV screens in Technicolor spandex. In many ways, it bridged the gap between cartoon silliness and live-action spectacle, years before superhero movies were a Hollywood mainstay. The show vanished almost immediately, never becoming more than a quirky footnote. But looking back, it's a time capsule of how seriously, or not, studios took superheroes in the late 70s. Forgotten? Absolutely. But it's a bizarre gem that proves DC would try anything to keep its heroes on screen. The Superpowers Team, Galactic Guardians, 1985 to 1986. By the mid-80s, DC and Hanna-Barbera knew the Super Friends formula was running out of steam. So they gave it one last shot of adrenaline with the Superpowers Team, Galactic Guardians, the darkest and most ambitious version of the series. It only lasted a single season, but it marked a turning point in how superheroes were portrayed on Saturday mornings. Unlike earlier Super Friends seasons, Galactic Guardians ditched the camp and leaned into drama. Plots tackled heavier themes: Superman struggling with his Kryptonian past, Cyborg joining the team and grappling with his identity, and even Batman confronting his childhood trauma in the now famous Fear episode, where he faces the murder of his parents. For many kids, it was the first time they saw Batman treated with genuine seriousness in animation. The villain roster also upgraded. Darkseid stepped in as the primary threat, bringing an edge of menace missing from the Legion of Doom's campier antics. His obsession with conquering Earth and pursuing Wonder Woman gave the series a sense of ongoing danger. Episodes felt less like standalone morality tales and more like serialized adventures, a bold move for the time. The animation was sharper, the tone more mature, and the writing braver. But despite all of that, ratings weren't strong enough to keep it alive beyond 1986. It quietly ended, overshadowed by the coming wave of late 80s and 90s animation revolutions. Today, Galactic Guardians is one of DC's most underrated animated experiments. It proved superheroes didn't always have to be lighthearted, and gave a glimpse of the storytelling depth that would later define Batman. The animated series. Forgotten in its own time, it now looks like the missing bridge between Saturday morning fun and modern superhero epics. Tarzan and the Super 7, 1978-1980. Few people remember Tarzan and the Super 7. Yet it was one of the wildest Saturday morning experiments of the late 70s. Airing on CBS from 1978 to 1980, it was less a single show and more a jam-packed anthology block. The headliner was Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, a surprisingly faithful take on Edgar Rice Burroughs' jungle hero. Unlike the slapstick Tarzan of earlier cartoons, this version battled villains, solved problems, and protected the jungle with real gravity. But Tarzan was only part of the package. The Super 7 referred to a rotating lineup of shorts, including the new adventures of Batman, Manta and Moray, Web Woman, Super Stretch and Micro Woman, and even the Freedom Force. One week you might watch a gritty Tarzan story, the next a zany Batmite episode, and after that, a trippy space adventure. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and unlike anything else on TV. For DC fans, the return of Batman Within the Block was the real gem. Seeing the Caped Crusader and Robin take the spotlight in brand new animated adventures gave the anthology legitimacy. Kids never knew what they were going to get. But that sense of variety made it feel like a grab bag of superhero and pulp fun. The show only lasted 2 years. But for those who caught it, Tarzan and the Super 7 was unforgettable. Forgotten now, it represents a moment when Saturday mornings were brave enough to throw everything at the wall and let kids decide what stuck. And there you have it, 15 forgotten DC cartoons from the 1970s and 80s. Some were bold experiments, some were awkward misfires, and a few were simply buried by time. But each one played a role in shaping how superheroes evolved on screen. Which of these do you remember? And which one shocked you the most to learn even existed? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history of animation. Because trust me, this rabbit hole only goes deeper.